This is Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Our guest this episode, Russell Reising, contributor to and editor of Beggars Banquet and the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Revolution. They Call My Name Disturbance. The Rolling Stones Beggars Banquet from 1968 is one of the seminal albums in rock history. Arguably, it not only marks the advent of the mature sound of the Rolling Stones, but lays out a new blueprint for an approach to blues-based rock music that would endure for several decades. From its title to the dark themes that pervade some of its songs, Beggars Banquet reflected and helped define a moment marked by violence, decay, and upheaval. It marked a move away from the artistic sonic flourishes of psychedelic rock towards an embrace of foundational streams of American music, blues, country, that had always underpinned the music of the Stones, but assumed new primacy in their music after 1968. This move coincided with and anticipated the roots moves that many leading popular music artists made as the 1960s turned toward a new decade. But unlike many of their peers, whose music grew more soft and subdued as they embraced traditional styles, the music and attitude of the Stones only grew harder and more menacing, and their status as representatives of the dark underside of the 60s rock counterculture assumed new solidity. For the Rolling Stones, the 1960s ended and the 1970s began with the release of this album in 1968. Beggars Banquet and the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Revolution, They Call My Name Disturbance, was released in hardcover and Kindle through Routledge in December of 2019. On August 2nd, Routledge will release the book in paperback through Routledge.com. Russell Reising is Professor of American Literature and Asian Studies at the University of Toledo. He's published widely on topics in American literature, literary criticism, popular music, and psychedelia, and he edited Every Sound There Is, The Beatles' Revolver, and The Transformation of Rock, and Speak to Me, The Legacy of Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, both from Ashgate. Now onto our discussion with Russell. To hear the music discussed in this episode, check out the show notes page. Russ, thanks so much for being on the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
An amazing roster of authors that contributed to this book. I want to make sure we give them due credit here because they did such an amazing job pulling back the many layers of this album, Beggars Banquet from the Stones, from the lyrics to the song structures, the time changes, so much more. Please correct me if I get any of these pronunciations wrong. I'm going to go through the list here. Okay, so we got Stephen Bauer.
Yep.
We've got Stephen Christman.
Yep.
Okay, Norma Coates.
Yep.
Here's a tough one, Jacopo Conti.
Jacopo Conti.
Jacopo Conti.
Yeah, he's my Italian collaborator.
Got it. Okay. How about this one, John Kovac, or is it Kovac?
Kovac.
Kovac. Brian Goodman. Kimi Karki. Here's another tough one. Akitsugu Kawamoto.
Akitsugu Kawamoto.
All right, I was close.
Yeah,
all right.
You were very close. I studied Asian languages in college, so I'm on top of those things.
Yeah, I saw that. That's very cool.
Yeah. No, Akitsugu is a great bass player, and he really understands the bass. I think his is one of the truly interesting contributions where he's arguing that Bill Wyman and Keith Richards' bass playing on the album really has anticipations of prog rock bass tendencies in it. I was real happy with his. I need to do a little bit of editing, to smooth out the English. But he's really a wonderful guy.
Yeah, just another fascinating aspect to the book. Jim LeBlanc, Kimberly Mack, James McGrath, Peter Mills, Ruth Talman, Steve Waxman. Did I get all those correct?
Those are all correct. I've worked with a number of them before. Some are in my book on the Beatles album Revolver. Some are in the Pink Floyd book on Dark Side of the Moon. It's a great group. The new people I worked with here were fantastic. And I think you really nailed the great variety. That's what I try to do in all three of these books that I've done. I can talk about the lyrics and about the cultural significance. I'm not a trained musicologist. I don't play an instrument, but trained as a literary scholar and with a lot of experience writing about psychedelia. I have a particular angle on that dimension. In fact, this essay on Beggars Banquet is a lot like an essay I contributed on a book dedicated to the Beatles' White Album.
Interesting. That one's already out?
Yeah, that was out. That book is called The Beatles Through a Glass Onion, edited by Mark Osteen, Osteen. He's a great, he's an English literature scholar, and he and I knew about each other's literary work, but we didn't know that we were both music aficionados as well. So it was really a pleasure when I got to meet him and contribute to that collection.
Yeah, and you are an author, but technically you're listed here as the editor, correct?
Well, yes. I put together the idea. I arrange all the contributors. I take care of organizing the book, herding people in certain directions so that the essays work together nicely. I do a full-scale edit. Fortunately, most of my native-speaking English contributors didn't need any editing. But the book was sort of my baby and my essay. It's listed as an introduction, but it's really a full-fledged essay on the psychedelic dimension of the album.
Now, your background, you are working at the University of Toledo. Are you from that area?
Actually, no one dreams of returning to Northwest Ohio, but yes, I was. And I started off my career at University of Oklahoma, and then I taught for quite a while at Marquette University in Milwaukee. And then I was recruited here, and it gave me a chance to bring my children to be close to their grandparents. And through a very strange and complicated variety of circumstances, it ended up launching my career as a scholar of popular music and psychedelia.
When and how did you become a fan of the Rolling Stones?
Well, I was a Rolling Stones guy significantly before I was a Beatles guy. I was a Dylan guy long before I was a Rolling Stones or a Beatles guy. But I had an older cousin whom I idolized, and he had a big impact on my musical tastes. But it's one of those moments that, you never forget. The first time I heard Time Is on My Side, the first couple times I saw them on television and they looked so scruffy. Mick Jagger just wore like a gray sweatshirt. And so my brother and I, whenever we would wear gray sweatshirts, we'd call them our Rolling Stones shirts. But just something about their music was rougher, and they never compromised. I've always said that the Beatles went downhill when they recorded Yesterday, because that's when my parents started liking them. And the last thing a teenager wanted in 1966 was for their parents to like the music they liked. The Rolling Stones, never crossed that divide. And I just sort of liked their rebellious attitude. Plus, as I've come to know in retrospect, they really walked the walk. They supported the African-American musicians whose traditions influenced them so strongly. In fact, there was a recent re-release of their, I think, the greatest live album ever recorded, Get Your Ya-Ya's Out. And it includes the full B.B. King and the full Ike and Tina Turner review sets, as well as the Rolling Stones set. And that dimension was always really important to me. I grew up listening to Motown a lot, and the whole idea of incorporating and integrating African-American traditions and African-American musicians, singers, songwriters, performers, was very, very important to me, even at a young age, growing up in a lily-white farm town in rural Ohio.
You said 1966, and you saw them on television. Am I guessing right with Ed Sullivan Show? Was that where they were on?
They were on the Ed Sullivan Show. They were also on a show called The Hollywood Palace. I think they were on TV quite a bit back then.
Yeah.
There's the famous incident when Ed Sullivan said, you have to sing "Let's Spend Some Time Together" rather than "Let's Spend the Night Together."
Oh, yeah, that was the famous story.
Yeah, but I saw them do quite a few songs on the television. And, of course, growing up, not in a big city, it was a long time before I had a chance to go to concerts. I didn't really get to a big concert until 1970. My first concert was great. It was the James Gang, James Taylor, and The Who in Cleveland.
Ooh, yeah, and James Gang, the local boys.
The James Gang, they were from Kent. Yeah, it was $5, and it changed my life. And that same summer, I saw Led Zeppelin and Sly and the Family Stone and John Mayall, all in the summer of 1970. And I mean, it just turned me into I was already a music lover, but, just usually with my headphones listening at 2 and 3 in the morning to underground, what they called underground FM back then. But once I actually saw this stuff in person, especially that variety, the James Gang, sort of traditional rock and roll, and then James Taylor came out just about the time Sweet Baby James was released. And it was one of those life-changing moments.
Going back to that Stones live album, first time I ever heard Midnight Rambler was on that album. And I can't listen to any other version. That's the 9-minute plus version. That's a classic. A classic.
I agree. I think they're uneven in performance. In fact, I haven't liked many of their live performances so I always think that, the Stones should have quit with Sticky Fingers. I know that's anathema. A lot of people think that Exile on Main Street is the great album, but I think most of those great rock groups had, from my estimation, a series of 3 records. For the Stones, it was Beggar's Banquet, Let It Bleed, and Sticky Fingers. For somebody like Jethro Tull, it was Stand Up, Benefit, and Aqualung. For Pink Floyd, it was, Metal, Dark Side of the Moon, and Wish You Were Here. I mean, they have those, clusters of 3 albums when they just really come together. You can see these energies developing, then they peak. And then after that, I think most of those groups didn't do stuff really, really great as those clusters ever again. For the Beatles, I always thought it was Rubber Soul, Revolver, and Sgt. Pepper.
But this is interesting because Exile on Main Street, you're leaving out of that. And a lot of people, of course, the critics love that. So is Exile? What are your thoughts on that album? Are you not a fan at all of it?
Jim LeBlanc and I, he's a contributor and one of my oldest, dearest friends. He and I just talked about that recently. And he says, it really is sort of like a party album that you can have on in the background. It doesn't really warrant the sonic dimension, I think, is really tinny, thin, and unpleasant. I also think the songs are kind of silly and pointless. I don't like the musicality. I don't like the lyricism. I don't like the production. I think it's a really third-rate album. I know that's anathema among Stones fans.
Yeah.
But I just don't. I mean, there are a couple good songs, but I tried listening to it again, I think last year, and I just, it does absolutely nothing for me. I think the expectations they set up were so intense and so great that it seemed really like a falling off from those 3 albums that I mentioned. Coming after Sticky Fingers, it was like a retreat into just sort of like junky music. I just never liked it.
Would it have benefited from being a single album?
I don't know. I don't think there is enough. I mean, for my personal taste, and I know they're idiosyncratic, I don't think there's enough material for even one great album, maybe one great side. I can't really go into much more detail just because I have refused or failed to give the album much more of a chance. I've listened to it maybe 10 times in my whole life, a lot when I first bought it. And after that, it just sort of sat in the corner because I just, it doesn't do anything for me that I value the Stones for doing in their earlier career.
That's what makes music discussions like this so interesting, because everybody has a different opinion about every band and album and song.
Agreed.
Beggars Banquet, that's the album that marked a change in direction of the band's sound, coming of age for the band. Prior to this, they were recording what's been called psychedelic pop. What's your opinion of the music they did prior to Beggars Banquet?
Well, I think Between the Buttons is one of the great albums of all time. That's the one with Ruby Tuesday, Who Wants Yesterday's Paper, Something Happened to Me Yesterday, Connections. I mean, it's a great, great, great album. Their Satanic Majesty's Request, I think they fell into the media-driven Beatles versus Stones competition groove and, tried to come out with something like their Sgt. Pepper. And it has some strong moments. I like it more than a lot of people do. In fact, a lot of people valued Beggars Banquet because they said they put aside, the psychedelic disaster of their Satanic Majesty's request and got back to what came to be called roots music. It marked a huge change of direction for the Stones. And I think I go back and forth. I have 3 albums that on any given day I'll say are the 3 greatest albums, ever recorded. That's Dylan's Bringing It All Back Home, John Lennon's Plastic Ono Band, his first solo album, and Beggar's Banquet. That's my top 3. And based on the day, I might say Van Morrison's Astral Weeks, or I might even put Jethro Tull's Stand Up in there. But more or less, when I'm thinking clearly, which is not all the time these days, it's one of those 3: Dylan, the Stones, or John Lennon.
Jimmy Miller's a big part of that new direction and sound for the Stones. This is the first album he produced with the band.
Yes.
And the book starts things off with a discussion of the work of Jimmy Miller. He's a drummer turned producer. His drumming background, a big part of the sound of this album. How important is Jimmy Miller to this album, in your opinion?
Well, my friend John Kovach, who was in the Eastman School of Music, he's a musicologist and a great guitar player. His argument in the book is that Jimmy Miller, essentially, along, with closely working with Jagger and Richards, was essential to hammering out the sound that they get on Beggar's Banquet. And I think his direction ended up being essential because there's a certain sound to that album. It starts off, of course, the unforgettable introduction to Sympathy for the Devil. And from that moment on, it just has there's sort of like a dark richness about the album. That's, by the way, that's also what appealed to me about that middle period, for me, Jethro Tull sound. There was sort of like a muted, dark richness to Benefit and Stand Up and Aqualung. I don't know. Again, I don't know much about music technology, whether it was amplifiers or guitar pickups or the engineering, but there was something about that really appealed to me, and that's precisely what is missing on Exile on Main Street.
And Beggar's Banquet is pre-Mick Taylor era Stones. Sometimes people get that mistake and they think, is that the one with Mick Taylor in it? It is not. The lineup is Mick Jagger vocals, Keith Richards guitar and bass, Bill Wyman bass, Charlie Watts drums, and then there is Brian Jones. Brian's story on this album, well documented, and he was in a bad way. Erratic behavior due to heavy drug use. Mick and Keith had pretty much given up on him by now. Jimmy Miller said he was unreliable, but having said that, he is on all but 2 of the tracks.
That's exactly right. By the way, there's a great documentary about Brian Jones's death that makes a very, very convincing case that it was murder.
I may have seen this one.
I can't remember it, but there was some workers working on his estate in the country. And there had been a big row earlier about unpaid bills. And there's all kinds of really serious, it wasn't simply that he was all doped up and drowned in the swimming pool.
Is this the one with the theory that his gardener did it?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Either gardener or somebody working on the house, a construction, the head of the construction crew. But no, Brian Jones was always my favorite Stone. And as Jim LeBlanc in his essay makes very clear, it was Jones who was responsible for the exoticism of a lot of the Stones sound. He would bring in, he was sort of like the Syd Barrett in Pink Floyd. He was there from the beginning. He was sort of a leader, and he sort of became unreliable due to any number of things. Drug use, but keep in mind, what have been regarded as people going off the deep end with drugs, especially LSD, in many cases were probably undiagnosed cases of schizophrenia, which hits exactly that age group. Syd Barrett probably didn't do so much acid that he went crazy. Brian Jones probably didn't do so many drugs that he went off the deep end. I have a feeling that these were underlying cases of undiagnosed schizophrenia, because back then, you have to remember, people didn't know what the hell they were doing with mental illness. Where I grew up, all they knew to do was to give you electric shock treatments and put you out to pasture, which is essentially what happened to Syd Barrett, and it might have been on the verge of happening with Brian Jones.
He did make some legitimate. Yeah, I was going to say, he does make some legitimate contributions to at least one or two of the tracks, and even Mick pointed out on one of them, and we'll get to all of these tracks. We'll start with, of course, the first track, the opening track. There are 10 in all, and all 10 of them are brilliant. And as John Kovacs points out, perhaps no track on Beggar's Banquet better illustrates the long path a track can take to completion than Sympathy for the Devil, the opening track. And there's so much to dissect with this song, and this book pulls apart the song, puts it all back together so well. I listened to this song with a completely different perspective. As a radio listener and as a longtime classic rock DJ, I've heard and played this song so many times that I needed a book like this to bring me back to it. So let's start with the percussion. Stephen Bauer writes about how the song opens with an extended passage of isolated percussion instruments played in an Afro-Cuban style. And Jimmy Miller, a big part of this, but also Charlie Watts, who is an amazing drummer and often underrated. What are the Stones without Charlie? A huge big band jazz guy. He knew that Afro-Cuban mambo beat very well, and he cited Kenny Clark's drumming on Dizzy Gillespie's A Night in Tunisia as the inspiration, to the beat. He's one of the few from that era who could pull this off.
Yep. Well, this is true of Ringo Starr, too. By the way, Stephen Bauer wrote the essay on Ringo in my Beatles book on Revolver. He's a great drummer and a great musicologist. He's really a good guy. But no, I think Charlie Watts is underrated, but if you listen to him, you can't imagine anybody doing a better job on the drum kit for the Stones. Just the same with Ringo. Ringo was wildly underrated. I don't think he hits or misses a wrong note. It's rarely flashy, but it's deceptively brilliant. And I think Charlie Watts was too.
I still can't believe that they actually recorded songs without Charlie. That was on Dirty Work in '86. There are tracks on there, I think, more than half of that album without Charlie Watts. Imagine a Rolling Stones song without Charlie Watts.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to accept them without Bill Wyman, too.
Yeah.
But, Bill Wyman was always not the odd man out, but, he was older than the rest. For him, it was always more like, just like a paying gig. He had a family. And but when he left, they managed to find, I don't know the guy's name, but the guy that tours with him, a brilliant bass player. He sort of like stays on the sidelines, but he's really great. But I can't imagine them going on stage without Charlie Watts.
And he is now, I believe he's hit the 80 mark, right, Charlie?
I don't know. I wouldn't doubt it.
Yeah, I know he's older than the rest of the guys. Mick just turned 73. I can look it up.
Please do.
Yeah.
I don't know. I know I'm 68, and to think that he's only 5 years older than I am would break my heart.
Well, but the Stones are an inspiration. Basically, what they're telling you, Russ, is you've still got a long way to go.
Well, I'd love to think so. I would love to think so.
You got a lot of rocking left in you. Yeah, he is 78, Mick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fortunately.
Yeah.
Do you know a group called the Straubs?
Yes.
I saw them quite a few times back in the early 70s, but recently they've been touring. Just three of them. It's called the Acoustic Straubs. And David Cousins, who's always been sort of like the lead figure in that group, told a great story about how in their earliest days, when Sandy Denny was still their singer, before she joined Fairport Convention, they were opening for the Stones in like an extended gig on some island just off the British coast. They were learning their chops. The Stones were in their earliest days, doing a lot of R&B covers and soul music. And he talks about how, Keith Richards loved the gentle, melodic, sort of like medieval folky sound that the Straubs were cultivating back then. And I think that says a lot about Keith Richards, but it says a lot about the Stones too, because the sheer breadth of musical expression on Beggar's Banquet, I think, is a testament to their collective tastes and their collective genius. I mean, you have those two anthems. I think in those days, almost every Stones album had two anthems. The ones on Let It Bleed were Let It Bleed and You Can't Always Get What You Want. Much weaker anthems, I think, than Salt of the Earth and Jigsaw Puzzle. I think that's part of what distinguishes Beggar's Banquet for me, is that those longer anthemic songs that they tend to end sides with, I think the two strongest ones they ever wrote are Salt of the Earth and Jigsaw Puzzle.
Mick, as a lyricist,
yep,
these lyrics are brilliant.
Again, variety of taste. And there was that, I think, there's no direct influence from Motown to, and, R&B and soul music to his lyricism. But there's, I think, a general sentiment, a general sense of some evocative explorations of the fringes of experience that he gets at. And of course, here you have songs that were would be it would be really hard to produce a song like Stray Cat Blues these days. Just like it's really hard to teach Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita these days.
We're going to get to that one. I know that has not aged well.
No, it had. Well, it's still a brilliant song.
It is. Lyrically, hasn't aged well.
Yeah, the live version on Get Your Yayas Out is brilliant as well. But I mean, you have that, and you have Parachute Woman. You've got Factory Girl. I mean, these are tributes to the kinds of women that people normally associated the Stones with, whether they were in fact, part of the low down and dirty, fringes of London society is really up for grabs. They were they came from much more privileged backgrounds and were much more fastidious in their sexual tastes than the Beatles were. In fact, there's a great book called The Beatles versus the Stones, I think, in which the author makes a very strong case for the Beatles bordering on pedophilia and liking very young girls in the days that they were coming up the ranks. But the Stones, he argues, for all the gritty, sort of like half in the gutter look they cultivated, he said they were really coming from middle class families, whereas the Beatles, were coming from a much rougher area. As Liverpudlians, they grew up in a much rougher area. Certainly George Harrison, was coming, from some fairly reduced circumstances. But the Stones, I think part of it was they had a great manager and they cultivated this sense of being the bad boys of rock. I think part of that was a personae, rather than, just, being the fact that these were basically, deviants. They weren't Satan worshipers, they weren't pedophiles, but they were able to represent and channel those darker social and sexual urges in a lot of their music. They opened up music more than any group. They opened up the lyricism of music more than any other group. I mean, who else was writing about women on tranquilizers in the 60s? Mother's Little Helper. But I know my own mother and millions of American women were whacked out on booze and Valium, to deal with the difficulty of a bad marriage or, economic disadvantage and things like that. And the Rolling Stones were putting that out on top 40 radio. While the Beatles were singing, Eleanor Rigby, which is a beautiful song and, clearly evocative and filled with really powerful emotions, the Stones were exploring a completely different socioeconomic range. Sexual aggressiveness, some songs like Under My Thumb. John Lennon writes, "Run for your life if you can, little girl." And Under My Thumb has, that darkness to it. In fact, they were playing Under My Thumb at Altamont when the murder of James Meredith began. It wasn't Sympathy for the Devil, it was Under My Thumb. And the Stones were able to work that into, an overall atmosphere of their music that everything contributed to.
Some of the lyrics to some of those Stones songs actually got past a lot of people. I think.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of I Can't Get No Satisfaction, the one line in that song that seemed to be lost on everyone. about the girl going through, her period, and
Yep.
what's that lyric, and nobody picked up on it.
You can see I'm on a losing streak. You maybe come back maybe next week.
Yeah.
As you see, I'm on a losing streak.
Yeah. And nobody picked up on that one.
Well, my own life was changed by Sgt. Pepper, which was the first album to print the lyrics. And growing up, in a rural community where the teachers at my high school, most of them were teachers in order to justify their coaching salaries. Nobody could turn me on to words and poetry and lyrics. And then all of a sudden, first of all, Dylan was there. And even though I couldn't figure out a lot of what he was saying, and I didn't understand a lot of what I could make out from the lyrics, there was something always intriguing and provocative and just beyond the threshold of my understanding. But once Sgt. Pepper came out and we could actually see the lyrics, all of a sudden that piqued my intellectual interest. So it wasn't just sort of like an emotional or a spiritual or an aesthetic reaction to the music anymore. It was intellectually engaging. And of course, Satisfaction came out and people didn't really know the lyrics. In fact, I forget the term, but there's a term for misheard lyrics. Like Jimi Hendrix said, "Excuse me while I kiss this guy."
That's the famous one.
Yeah, in fact, there's a great Los Angeles Forum performance of the Jimi Hendrix Experience when he says, "Excuse me while I kiss that policeman over there."
There's another one I'm thinking too. Something about the bathroom to the left.
Oh no, there's a bathroom. That's Creedence Clearwater Revival.
Oh yeah, John Fogerty. Fogerty used to have fun with that one. Yeah, and every now and then he would actually sing.
Bad Moon Rising.
Yes.
In fact, that was my nickname, Bad Moon Rising.
Russell Bad Moon Rising. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. You mentioned poetry. Mick has said the lyrics to Sympathy were inspired by two literary sources. One was a 1966 Russian novel, the other a poem from the 1800s.
Yeah, they're both important. They're both again, the great thing about the Stones was they were influenced. They were influenced by these things, but Jagger and Richards, when he was involved, always put their own particular spin on things. A lot of great music is borrowing, right? Borrowing lyrics, borrowing riffs, etc. I see Led Zeppelin was finally just cleared from charges of plagiarism in Stairway to Heaven. But for instance, Yes, when they came out with I think one of the great underrated classics of the prog era, 2-record set called Tales from Topographic Oceans. They were influenced by the autobiography of a yogi. And they incorporated a lot of the ideas they got from a very popular spiritual book in the late 60s, early 70s. And they borrowed from it. The borrowing, I think the quality of the borrowing and the cleverness with which the borrower alters, changes, works on, mashes up, the sources that they're dealing with, has a lot to do with how well they write their own lyrics. You never find anybody who just copies. And the people who do draw on other sources often do so even though they have a tremendously rich lyrical imagination themselves, but they acknowledge something and they turn it into something very personal and unique in many cases.
I think it's Charles Baudelaire, by the way.
Baudelaire, yeah. Fleur de Mal. That's a collection of poems, yeah.
Kimberly Mack breaks down the lyrics. The first-person devil narrator. He tells his tale roughly in chronological order in this song, allowing the listener to engage the story much like a reader might encounter a book. The character Mick is portraying politely introduces himself. Charming, man of wealth and taste. Mick singing softly, non-threatening. This idea of the devil appearing as a charming and humorous sophisticate is one that has long existed in both African-American folklore and in the African-American blues tradition. Talk about the Stones' fascination with African-American blues tradition, artists like Robert Johnson, because this really plays a crucial role, as Kimberly writes, in the construction of the lyrics to Sympathy for the Devil.
Well, Kim Mack is a colleague of mine, one of the great hires University of Toledo's ever made, and she's really, carving a great path for herself. But the Stones, as many of these groups were powerfully influenced by African-American blues. In fact, lots of groups, for instance, the Yardbirds, guitar players joined and left the Yardbirds based on whether or not they thought they were sticking to the blues tradition enough. You know, they had Eric Clapton, who left because he thought they were getting too pop. John Mayall's Blues Breakers was a training ground for lots of people. Peter Green from Fleetwood Mac. These people idolized the blues because it was some of the first music that got over to England. That had, there was, different ways that they had access to this. But for some reason, and I'm not sure exactly what it is, R&B and blues had a particular lure for British guitar players. And the Stones were true to that. If you look at the first three Stones albums, they're largely cover versions. Just like a lot of the Beatles' first three albums are largely cover versions of blues songs. They toured with R&B acts in England in the early days. But the Stones, as I said before, were really true. When they got to Chicago, they wanted to go to Chess Records. And they, that was a highlight for them. They never tried to hide from or to deny or to obscure the extent to which they were indebted to people like Muddy Waters or Howlin' Wolf or B.B. King, the really great, blues players. They were into the Chicago blues. So for them to, pay tribute to Robert Johnson, more of a Delta blues man, that was stretching it out for them. They like that more raucous sounding Chicago blues sound, the electrified blues more than the acoustic blues of, say, Son House or Robert Johnson from the Mississippi Delta. But I think that was absolutely essential. And the way their music evolved kept a bluesy atmosphere to it. Of course, that really comes back in Exile on Main Street, which has a lot, which is a lot more blues inflected as a whole than certainly than Sticky Fingers or Let It Bleed. They were true to their roots, and they remain true to their roots today. In fact, one of the great things I missed in my life, when I was in graduate school in Chicago, the Stones accepted an invitation from the little town of Rockford, Illinois, to play in Rockford. And late that night, they ended up at Buddy Guy's blues club down in Lincoln Park in Chicago. I guess, the Stones just walked in and they were playing with Buddy Guy and Junior Wells and everybody else who was on stage. They just sort of showed up and were embraced and welcomed by the black musicians. There was, as far as I know, there wasn't the kind of resentment directed towards the Stones that there were towards other artists. I knew a good friend of mine was Sam Andrew from Big Brother and the Holding Company. He passed away recently. He told a story. We were sitting in San Francisco one day. He told a story about when he and Janis Joplin went to hear Big Mama Thornton perform. And Janis Joplin idolized Big Mama Thornton. Anyway, Big Mama noticed Janis Joplin in the audience and just went berserk on her, saying, "Well, I can see there are some white girls in the audience tonight who like to take my songs and make lots of money from them. I never get the money from them." And Sam said Janis just basically melted and went under the table. She was so distressed and humiliated.
But with the Stones, not the case.
Not the case with the Stones. And that's largely because they, even at the peak of their prime, 1968, 69, 70, they would tour with R&B groups and other black musicians. And I think B.B. King gives a great testimony to that in the recently added added set to Get Your Yayas Out, when he says he's thanking him, and he says, I'd really like to also thank the Stones, the stars of tonight's show. He says, because if it wasn't for the support of people like the Stones, you wouldn't have got to hear B.B. King tonight. And that wasn't just him bowing down. It was a genuine tribute to the kind of support that the Stones gave, and I think probably continue to give to a lot of the musicians that were their heroes when they were kids, and continue to be influences on them.
Before we move on to the country blues song, the next track, one last note on Sympathy. The Kennedy's line. Originally, that was to be Who Killed Kennedy, but after Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, Mick went back in and re-recorded the line, changed it to Who Killed the Kennedys. Was that all Mick's idea?
Yep. As far as I know, it was all Mick's idea. Well, it seems as though, that was an idea that had to be in the air. If a second Kennedy is dead, it didn't take a rocket scientist to come up with saying, well, we can change that to the Kennedys. But as far as I know, it was Mick who initiated that.
What do you think he meant by, after all, it was you and me?
That's a tough one. That was a fairly popular sentiment back then. Buffy St. Marie, in her great song, Universal Soldier, says, we can't blame other people because, it's all of us, including you and me, who are lending ourselves as bodies for the war. And it was just a way that young people were trying to accept, I think, responsibility for being participating members in an emerging counterculture that they thought they could do more with. It's almost a cliche, not as much of a cliche as a song like Wild Horses, which I always thought was pretty pathetic. I mean, you can't get much more of a cliche than Wild Horses Couldn't Drag Me Away, even though it's a nice song. But it was a sentiment that was very much alive at the time, where we're all sort of in this together. Eric Burden's, Monterey, where it says, even the cops grooved with us. They were, people were looking for a way to be more inclusive, and perhaps this is just speculation on my part. Part of the way in which the Stones accepted the responsibility for that inclusivity was to suggest that maybe those of us who put these people on a pedestal, and still played a part in basically the war machine, have to accept some of the responsibility. That I'm just guessing here, Erica. That's a mysterious line. I think it's one of the most troubling lines, certainly the most troubling line on the album. And we're talking about an album that has Stray Cat Blues in it as well.
Yeah, but I think that's what they wanted. I always interpreted it as there's a lot that can be done with protesting, but if it goes too far, the result is somebody who takes too far by taking it into their own hands.
Nice.
Maybe.
I like that. Certainly the protests at the 68 Democratic Convention, all of a sudden you get the idea that you get a wacko who does take it too far. And of course, the death of the murder of James Meredith of Altamont, ends up, sort of putting a cap on that tendency.
Yeah.
But keep in mind, there was a dark side to the Stones anyway. I mean, you don't have a song like Midnight Rambler.
Very dark. Very dark.
They are exploring, as I said, Midnight Rambler, they're exploring, the sensibility of a serial killer. Just the way they've explored the sensibility of, what Nabokov would have called the nymphette in Stray Cat Blues, or, lower class factory girls or parachute women. I mean, they didn't shy away from anything like that.
Yeah, a lot of the songs, they come off almost as a Martin Scorsese film. They're very dark, which I think of Travis Bickle and the Taxi Driver when I think of After All, It Was You and Me. I think of him. Like, look what we did. We're fighting for something.
Yeah.
And are we to blame for this guy to take it into his own hands. Hey, it could be completely wrong, but again, I think that's what they want. They want you to wonder, like the Carly Simon song. Who is that song about?
You're so vain. You probably think the song. See, that's a problematic song because if it is in fact about the person she's singing to,
Mick Jagger, maybe.
It's not that he's vain; it's that he understands.
Yeah.
In other words, if she's saying you're so vain, you probably think the song is about you, and it is about Jagger, and he thinks it's about him. Is that vanity or insight?
Right.
It's a problematic tune. But, the closest the Beatles got to exploring, that side of life, Lovely Rita Meter Maid, which I think is one of the songs that I wish was left off Sgt. Pepper and Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever put in instead of, say, When I'm 64 or Lovely Rita. Maybe in the song Revolution, but, don't you know that you can count me out? Of course, on the slow version of the album, they say, and in. But even so, the Beatles wanted to toy with the ideas of revolution. The Rolling Stones gave you Street Fighting Man, and Sympathy for the Devil and Midnight Rambler. They were basically out on the barricades, at least in terms of their musical presentations and their stage personae.
I think that's why if I have to choose between the Stones or the Beatles, I always pick the Stones because I like that little dark tinge to the music.
Yep. Yeah.
Some darker colors there splashed in with the pretty colors.
Yep. I think if the Stones would have had somebody like George Martin working with them, there's no because George Martin was as instrumental as any of the four Beatles in what songs the Beatles ended up producing, how they sounded, how they produced, how they sequenced them, etc. The Stones didn't have a technological and musicological genius working with them. George Martin plays lots and lots of instruments. He scores the strings for lots of the songs. He plays the harpsichord. He organizes the choruses. The Rolling Stones with a George Martin type figure is idle speculation, but there's no telling how much more innovative they might have been. There's a consistency in the Stones, like I said, in that, tracing from, I would say, Between the Buttons through Satanic Majesty, through Beggar's Banquet, through Let It Bleed, through Sticky Fingers. There's a kind of coherence in subject matter and musical styles. They rarely stray outside of stuff that a rock ensemble could do quite nicely on stage live. The Beatles wouldn't have been able to do most of their stuff live back then. And the Stones, as dense and as complex as they were, those were songs that they could do very nicely live, except for maybe 2,000 Light Years from Home, or maybe parts of She's a Rainbow. I don't know. I never, heard them or saw them attempt to do that. Although I have seen videos of Paul McCartney doing Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Although, they've got somebody playing, I think a massive row of synthesizers and keyboards that people just didn't have access to back then.
Let's get to track 2, No Expectations. Country blues song, Brian Jones, featured on bottleneck guitar. Piano work from Nicky Hopkins. So Nicky Hopkins is another guy who is an important part of the Stones' history. The song's protagonist was rich, now he's poor. Ruth Talman points out that the song is evocative of the adage of the pre-Socratic Heraclitus, who proclaimed that we can't step in the same river twice. Change is the only constant in the world. She cites the lyrics, "Take me to the airport and put me on a plane. I've got no expectations to pass through here again."
Yeah.
Deep song. Another deep one from the Stones from this album.
Deep song. And look at the jolt that you get from the end of Sympathy for the Devil going into that song. That's one of the things that the sequencing and the transitions on this album are beautiful. I think one of the things that is lost, by the way, with CDs is there's no, there used to be that there were 4 really crucial songs on an album, the first and last song on each side. And so, when you went from listening to Jigsaw Puzzle, and then you had to get up and go over and flip it, and then you have Street Fighting Man, that's a jolt. When you go from I Want You, She's So Heavy, finishing off side one of Abbey Road, and you go and you put on there's Here Comes the Sun. Those were massively important songs. So, I mean, now, you put on a CD and it's just, a flow of songs. You can even rearrange them if you want. But I think that all has to do with the transitions. There's something fortunate about that. I mean, a lot of people love, geez, on a CD, you can get, hour and a half of good music, which is usually true. But it's like, I'll use an example from my own profession. When I wrote my dissertation, I had to write it on a typewriter. And so if I had to go back and retype a page, I had to retype the whole page, maybe from a mistake on line 3. My guess is with word processing, dissertations are twice as long as they used to be because you didn't have to worry about stuff like that. And I think, the coherence of a lot of those albums is great. There's still some really, really great, long albums these days. Roger Waters has some brilliant solo stuff like Amused to Death. To go into No Expectations, I think, really anchors the album. Ruth Tolman, by the way, was a philosopher. Her contribution to the book, I think, was really. There's not a weak essay in the book, I think, and hers, adds that dimension to it. And it really highlights, I think, the coherence of the sensibility. It's not similar in lyrics, right? A lot of these songs are very different in the lyrical drift and even the musical style, but there's a sensibility that is at the core of Beggar's Banquet. And I think it is that glorying in the fringes of society, the fringes of experience, the fringes of belief. And that comes along with a kind of a sonic landscape, now they would call it probably a sonic ecosystem, within which these songs all make a kind of sense. And as different as they might sound, they all work together very nicely. But they work especially well in the sequencing that we get going from one song to the next.
Yeah, we get to track 3, the country western waltz, Dear Doctor.
Yep.
That's when you wrote that the song is about a jilted lover simultaneously devastated and relieved by his intended's runaway bride escape. Brian Jones on harmonica, some interesting observations also from Stephen Bauer regarding the use of the tambourine by Charlie Watts. Mm-hmm. It is perhaps the loudest tambourine on a Stones record. That is great.
I think you're right. But yeah, I mean, he says,
that's what he wrote, by the way, right? Stephen wrote that. Perhaps the loudest tambourine. We got to put that to a test. Everybody listen to all of your Stones songs. See if there's a louder tambourine or a cowbell.
More tambourine.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, it refers to, as a cow. A girl I have to marry is a 4-legged sow, and I'm soaking up drinks like a sponge. So, he clearly isn't really looking forward to this. And then she ditches him, and he seems devastated. So, again, I don't know whether that's supposed to celebrate their sense of what like a Kentucky or Tennessee shotgun wedding might be like. But the ambiguity, the ambivalence of the whole thing, I mean, that's not simply a jilted lover song. The jilting is release and torture. And they get at that. That's, I think, that yoking of opposites, that yoking of contradictions. It was what I focus on in my essay. I was focusing on the psychedelic dimension, which is the way of a particular vision being able to incorporate ranges of experience or even types of people that seem not to be able to be yoked logically. They will have, Stray Cat Blues with 1,000 grandmas waving their hankies in a jigsaw puzzle. It just is an all-inclusive album. And I think it's the largest vision of any album ever, with the possible exception, albeit of 2 records of the Beatles, often called the White Album. That explores a equal variety of types of characters, but not an equal variety of ethical, moral, and spiritual experiences. Whereas I think Beggar's Banquet does exactly that.
And while we get some or plenty of interesting lyrical twists and turns, there's some sonic moments on this album that are very interesting. And Parachute Woman is the next one, track 4. This is the Chicago Blues inspired track. You talk about the Chicago Blues. Keith Richards here. He's playing acoustic guitar in an open E tuning. He recorded it on his recently acquired Philips portable cassette recorder. And this is fascinating. The cassette recording was then played back through an external speaker, recorded onto the studio's multi-track machine for additional tracking, and this produced an unexpected result, forcing acoustic guitars through a cassette player. That gave it an interesting distortion.
You know, one of the things, Street Fighting Man is all acoustic guitar. And it's just layered, and there's so much distortion that it's really hard. That's the way in which the album, I think, is sonically innovative in what they're doing with the percussive dimension. Stephen Bauer does a great job of that, but also what they're doing with the guitar. I mean, there's everything from slide guitar to, conventional rock, lead and rhythm guitars to, the wall of acoustic guitar sounds in Street Fighting Man that really, if you're not thinking about it, you don't even notice that it's not electric guitars because the song is so, rocks out so hard.
Yeah. Jigsaw Puzzle, one of my all-time Stones favorites, finishes outside one of Beggar's Banquet. And the central character in this song is a gangster, a lifelong outlaw, who is also a family man. Ruth Talman does an amazing job breaking down this song, the frightening uncertainty of a world without morality. In this song, there are themes of confusion and uncertainty. Hunker down on that jigsaw puzzle before things get even more confusing. While it's simple to see the world in terms of good guys and bad guys, everything appears to fall in shades of gray. Now, Russ, the first person who came to mind when I read this, Richard Kuklinski, a.k.a. the Iceman. Do you know that?
The Iceman.
Right?
Wow.
He's a guy who was
That's
a
right.
serial killer, hitman, lived a second life that was completely different, had a wife, kids at home, once told the story of, I believe, where he helps his family put up a Christmas tree, tells his wife he'll be back in a bit, goes out, kills a guy in cold blood, comes back home, watches his murder reported on the news with the tree all lit up in this warm moment with his family.
He loved his daughters.
So what are your thoughts on Jigsaw Puzzle?
Well, I think you put it right and Ruth put it right. It's also one of the songs that I focus on in exactly that dimension, which is the idea of the song yoking what seem to be impossible opposites. That I say, first of all, it's often seen as one of the hallmarks of psychedelic experience, is the as John Coltrane said after his first LSD tour, says he perceived the interconnectedness of all life forms, and was able to appreciate and to understand that there's no inside and no outside, that good and bad, or they're not morally relative as much as they are yoked at a much higher level of generality. And the idea of a gangster who is a family man ends up getting at that. I mean, you imagine gangsters like pitching pennies or doing some weird tricks with switchblade knives, not doing jigsaw puzzles. That's something my stepmother and grandmothers do. But
what is the symbol of jigsaw puzzle? Is it to try to say that life is a puzzle? And
I think so.
Yeah, I'm just trying to put the pieces of my life together so I don't have to become that hitman who needs to do this to make a living.
I don't think he's trying to get his life together to ease himself out of a criminal life. I think the jigsaw puzzle is just the way that lives are. It's also, by the way, I think the way the album is. You take, these 10 pieces and how do you put them together? 10 songs, how do you put them together to make a coherent picture? And so I think there's a kind of meta dimension to that album, which is both, I think, the vision of the album of fitting all these disparate pieces together. If you look at one of them, you don't get the whole picture. It's not until you get them all together with Salt of the Earth. Keep in mind, Salt of the Earth is a very similar song, joining all these different kinds of people. And of course, we see these people on the album: Street Fighting Man, Parachute Woman, a jilted lover, the character in No Expectations, the gangster. All of these things, these characters, these soundscapes, these lyrics, individually, you can understand. Keep in mind, there was only one, I think, single released from that album. That was Street Fighting Man. I'm not sure Sympathy for the Devil was ever released as a single. I've always been an album guy, so I don't know about that. I might be completely wrong.
You're correct.
But
you're correct.
At
least according to Wikipedia, the only single was Street Fighting Man with No Expectations, the B-side.
It's an album.
Yeah.
You didn't hear most of these songs on the radio. Keep in mind, this is, before the advent and the flourishing of FM radio, which was in my lifetime, not until like 68, 69, 70. And then we called it underground FM. That's when the only sponsors they had were head shops and pizza places or waterbed stores, at least in Detroit. And it's an album's album. Like a lot of those, how many Jethro Tull songs did you ever hear on the radio before Aqualung? I don't think there were any. And these were artists and these were artistic visions that were going for the big picture. And I think that's really one of the great contributions of Beggar's Banquet.
Yeah.
The fact that it's an album. I mean, what they're going for here is an all-encompassing vision. You can take Street Fighting Man out, largely because it had, really great commercial potential. It was a obvious, sort of like an obvious radio hit. But even so, that was an odd song for the radio. Maybe not as odd as Mother's Little Helper, which was also, a big hit on, the AM radio. But I think what the Stones are going for here is an album vision, something that, it's not really, I'm going to say this, it's not a concept album, but it's really close.
One that FM radio would be welcoming with open arms when it arrived in the late 60s. Yeah, Tom Donahue in San Francisco area started FM radio where it was free form, and album like this, bring it on. We'll play every track.
Yeah. I mean, I think Beggar's Banquet is more of what could be considered a concept album than is Sgt. Pepper, which I don't think really had that much coherence. There's a lot of different songs, but how does Lovely Rita mesh with Within You, Without You, or Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, or A Day in the Life, But this album is, and I think the title says it all, Beggar's Banquet. It yokes the idea of beggars, street people, having a banquet, all of a sudden joined together in a really peculiar way, a feast, a celebration. And I think that's, if anything unites the album, it's that, I think I've said this before, it's that celebration of the overlooked. People that are not usually given a lot of attention. In fact, when I think back on it, that was the first idea I had of writing a PhD dissertation in English. It was going to be a dissertation on the philosopher William James and the poet William Carlos Williams, on the ways in which their philosophical and poetic projects work really hard to explore the fringes of experience and to render these fringes something other than anomalies, and to suggest that these fringes of experience are central to human experience. Maybe that's been something that has been eating away at me for a long time without my even realizing it.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this.
Hi there, this is Miles Copeland. You're listening to Eric Senich on Booked on Rock.
We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. We flip over to side 2, Street Fighting Man. This is a song you suspect could be a document of political principle and engagement. It is, the Beggar's Banquet album as a whole, a record of political and sociological protest. This is one of the all-time classics from the Rolling Stones.
What can a poor boy do except to sing for a rock and roll band? Because in sleepy London town, there's just no place for a street fighting man. I mean, this is an expose of the way in which political energies got translated into rock and roll music. You know, the Jefferson Airplane could say "up against the wall, motherfucker," or the MC5 could say "kick out the jams, motherfucker," and have to change that to brothers and sisters. But it was very, very hard to see a direct relationship between the radical or revolutionary, or even if you just want to reduce it to rebellious tendencies of, you know, what we were trying to call the counterculture back then, from music to political action. And so that song is at once a call to action, but also a suggestion that, well, those very energies that we wish could be on the barricades and, fighting cops and corrupt politicians, but we'll settle for being rock and roll stars because we're poor. You know, poor people have, according to that song, two options. Street fighting men, gangs, or sing for a rock and roll band. And I think that's one of those songs that is sort of like it's introspective, the same way that I think Prodigal Son is introspective or Jigsaw Puzzle is introspective. These songs are about the album, and they're also about the subject matter of their individual songs.
And even though these guys are from England, this song is not lost on the U.S. with Vietnam War going on.
Yep. I don't know much about what political radicalism was like in England. I think their engagement and their losses in Vietnam were, probably minuscule, not insignificant, but, numerically minuscule compared to those of the United States. But that was the fault of the United States. I think there were a lot of young people all over the place joined by music. Keep in mind, that was the common denominator. Whether you were a kid in Australia or a kid in France or Germany, my girlfriend is from the former Yugoslavia, and they were listening to the same music. Of course, that was a socialist country, and they knew they had it made compared to the dog eat dog world of the West. But what young people had back then as a common denominator was not just pop music, but popular music, rock and roll music. That formed sort of like a global identity. The way now that, Facebook or, various forms of social media, can construct a global identity. What I have in common with every single person in all three of my books, I worked really hard to get people I have Israeli scholars, Dutch scholars, Finnish scholars, English scholars, Japanese scholars, New Zealand, Canadian. I have scholars that I could get from all over the world of people I knew how to access, and because I wanted to bring these perspectives to bear from people who were probably not in every case, but for instance, Jacopo Conti and Akitsugu Kawamoto were younger. They were not alive when Beggar's Banquet was released, but I wanted to get the perspective of people who were alive all over the world commenting on this stuff. Because I have a feeling that you hear street fighting man, and I don't think it matters if you're hearing that in St. Petersburg or Helsinki or Berlin. I think it raises the pressure and evokes some deep-seated rebellious impulse that teenagers share in a lot of cultures.
I'm interested in why you used a lyric from this song, too, for part of the book title. Said My Name is Called Disturbance is the lyric in the song, and that's part of the book title. Standout lyric for you?
Yep. And I think it's what the album tries to do. The album tries to disturb our polite sensibility of what society is all about. I think this album is meant to disturb. I think a lot of art is meant to usher us into a different way of seeing the world. In fact, there's a technical term called defamiliarization in poetry, in which the whole goal is to help us see something that we become habituated to, or we become accustomed to, and help us to see it in a sparkling new way so that we no longer take it for granted. And I think that is a way of disturbing our conventional expectations and perspective. And I think the album is meant to disturb us. I mean, why? I mean, that's not the only reason why they would start off with Sympathy for the Devil, but just think of the impact that, I mean, I'll never forget the first time I put that album on. I mean, it transported me, it scared me, it excited me. It was all of those things, but it was very, very radical.
Everything a great rock and roll album should do.
Well, I agree. I agree. Not everybody agrees with that. This album isn't about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It's about rock and roll as an ethical and political lens through which to try to make sense of the world. I've had that argument with students at every university I've ever taught. If I teach a pop culture course, they say, Van Halen, man, Van Halen's what it's all about, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. I say, well, that's what a small segment of the rock tradition is about. It's not what all rock and roll is about. And it's not about what almost everything I've ever valued. You're not going to say that, Mr. Tambourine Man is about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Or, Positively 4th Street, or maybe like a Rolling Stone, who knows. But, my own personal taste has always been for the out of ordinary. William James called it non-ordinary consciousness when he experimented with drugs. And I think that for me, the ordinary was anathema. I had plenty of ordinary. I mean, what I wanted was to be taken out of the ordinary and ushered into something different. And if that something different was disturbing, it would be like surrealism, right? Or a really good film noir, where, there's something really, really lurking beneath the surface. That's why I think, for what it's worth, something's happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I got to beware. Now, the idea of rock as exposing something, almost like a detective or a detective novel or film noir, where all of a sudden we're in a world that we hadn't expected before. And Sympathy for the Devil does that, and I think it sets the stage for everything else that comes on the album. There's not a song as powerful or as disconcerting as the first song.
Yeah.
I think you and I both love Salt of the Earth.
Favorite track off of the album.
Yeah, but look at the framing of that. Salt of the Earth is a biblical expression. And you go from Sympathy for the Devil, and the album is framed by that, and then Salt of the Earth. It's framed from, the satanic overtones of the one to almost a biblical understanding of all the forgotten people, the whores, the prostitutes, the lepers, all these people that you're supposed to be inclusive of. And it's hard to get a broader moral range of themes than it is from those two songs. And I think they try to fit everything in between. Of course, if you have these two wild extremes, it's easy to find stuff that's between them.
And we haven't touched on that, the biblical connections. The next track on the album, Prodigal Son. That's the story of the prodigal son from the New Testament.
That's right.
The story of a young man who leaves behind his family and traditional way of life, but realizes freedom is not all it's cracked up to be. Comes back home to the comfort and stability of his old life, but it's under the authority and protection of a controlling and benevolent father. This is a cover song, but it's a song that's perfectly chosen for this album. This was written and recorded originally by a country blues artist, Reverend Robert Wilkins. The Stones may have learned this from seeing him perform in 1964 at the Newport Folk Festival. This is among more than a few songs on this album with those biblical references.
And again, it's that yoking that, I don't want to, keep beating a dead horse, but once you started out with Sympathy for the Devil, and then you have all these biblical references, I think those temper each other. The prodigal son, he goes away and he comes back. In Street Fighting Man, you can be a rebellious, rock-throwing revolutionary, or you could settle in and, become a member of the Rolling Stones, sing for a rock and roll band. So it's a way of expressing this dissatisfaction with the way things are, but in many cases, you're brought back into it. Just like in the Godfather, just when I was on the way out, they brought me back in. The line that Sal does in The Sopranos all the time, little Stephen Van Zandt. But I think that the biblical overtones are, first of all, they're obviously significant, numerous, and intentional. But we would hear them very, very differently, Eric, if the album didn't start with Sympathy for the Devil, and if there weren't songs like Dear Doctor and Stray Cat Blues on them, or Jigsaw Puzzle. In other words, you have these things thrown into a hopper. Depravity, promiscuity, sexual adventurism, political radicalism, reverence for, if not the worship of Satan, sexual infidelity. I mean, the guy's fiance leaves him to go with his brother down in Virginia with your brother Lou. There will be no wedding today. And so I think, you look at that and you look at the putative ethical basis of these various biblical references. And I think it's suggesting that, well, some of these might be nice sentiments, but you can't think about salt of the earth without thinking of the devil too, right? The devil's been everywhere in that song. I was in St. Petersburg. I killed, who killed the Kennedys? I mean, the devil is, and I think that's what's important about that song. The devil is omnipresent and omniscient in Sympathy for the Devil.
And he's hiding in plain sight most times.
Yep. And once you establish that as sort of like the foundation of the rest of the songs, it's very hard to hear the songs either lyrically, philosophically, or musically without Sympathy for the Devil, somewhere in your mind. That's why I think as an album, it's so significant, because the album as a work of art is really an invention of the late 1960s, when songwriters, largely riding on the wave of Dylan and the Beatles, getting stirring people to think more aggressively about these things. I think that becomes the great contribution of the late 1960s, is the album as meditative, philosophical, intellectual. Right before that, keep in mind, it takes until Revolver, basically, for the Beatles to stop writing just sort of like silly love songs. Not that Norwegian Wood is a silly song, but Revolver is the first album recorded after the Beatles all had smoked marijuana. And before that, it's about, boy meets girl, boy loses girl, run for your life if you can, little girl. Lyrically, very, very shallow. And that's what made people boo Dylan when he went electric. Because the folk scene was the scene of historical tradition and ethical righteousness. And they thought electronic music, electrical music, rock and roll and pop and maybe even doo-wop was just silly playthings. It's with albums like Beggar's Banquet that all of a sudden rock and roll incorporates the very things that the folk tradition had prided itself on. Some of these are old folk songs. It wouldn't be at all surprising that they heard Wilkins do Prodigal Son at the Newport Folk Festival. Wouldn't be surprising at all, because that's where people thought you went for meaning, folk music, not the Beatles or the Hollies or Freddie and the Dreamers or people like that. That was regarded as trash by arguably a rearguard folk tradition. But songs like Prodigal Son and the complex mixture of themes is, I think, one of the great contributions. That's why it's in there always jostling with Plastic Ono Band and Bringing It All Back Home is my favorite album.
Stray Cat Blues, as we mentioned, this is a misogynistic song. It's about a man looking to have sex with an underage groupie, 15 years old to be exact. Why do you think that the critics overlooked this? They gave the song rave reviews. Why do you think that is?
I don't think they overlooked it. No. I think groupies and sex with what are now considered to be underage and would have been legally underage back then was far more common and far less horrifying in 1968, 1969, 1970 than it is now. I'm not saying that that's a good thing, but keep in mind, there's no trace in that song of coercion or anything other than joyous coming together. Now, there's this girl wants to come up. You know, I can hear the click-clock of your feet on the stairs, right? She's coming to him. This isn't coercion. This isn't prostitution. This is we don't even know if it's a groupie, right? It might just be a guy waiting for a young girl to come to him. It's not necessarily a groupie, but I think it evokes that groupie image. And as I said, back then, I once taught Lolita. The first time I taught a graduate course, when I was finishing my dissertation, I taught a course on the contemporary American or post-war American novel to returning students, largely, 20-somethings and up to like 60-somethings at a branch campus of Roosevelt University. And Lolita the class was exclusively women. Lolita didn't bother them at all. Not at all. I went in there. I mean, I had to use a pre-existing syllabus. Boy, are you sure? This is a class of conservative, upper, affluent women. It didn't bother them at all. But the John Updike novel, A Month of Sundays, about extramarital affairs, had them up in arms. So this was in 1983. As late as 1983, Lolita it didn't shock. I don't even think it offended, because I asked people what they thought of it. And they tended to see it as an exploration of a pedophile's depravity. It didn't bother them.
Yeah.
Shockingly. I mean, I've been thinking about that lately, thinking about how strange that course was. I never tried to teach it again, but I think something similar would be true of Stray Cat Blues. And I think the raunchiness of the sounds are so coherent with the raunchiness of the subject matter and the lyrics that its aesthetic coherence ends up maybe deflecting the kinds of hostility that it would certainly receive these days. I bet the Rolling Stones couldn't even do that in concert now.
I was going to say they haven't. This is according to a quick internet search. They haven't performed it live since 2003. In Sweden, it was last performed. Yeah,
good luck performing it again. And that, I think, is a very interesting index to the way in which popular culture, certainly in the Western Europe and North America, has evolved, rendering something that was regarded as a great song, a triumphant accomplishment, as something that would be impossible to perform these days.
The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. We're back with more of the Booked on Rock podcast. We're down to the last two tracks. Factory Girl is next. Stephen Bauer writes that this may well be the first and possibly the only commercial recording featuring mandolin, tabla, violin, and congas. Ry Cooder plays the mandolin on this track. He's the guy who turned Keith Richards onto his legendary open G tuning. There is something Charlie Watts is doing on this track that he later said drummers really shouldn't do. Has to do with the tabla, which is a percussion instrument most commonly used in North Indian classical music. He uses the drumsticks.
Sticks on the tabla, that's right. I just watched the film Penamaker's Monterey Pop last night. And, Ravi Shankar's performance is about a 20-minute raga. And his tabla player, it's all fingers and palms and hands. But Charlie plays it with sticks. That's interesting.
Experimentation. Again, that goes back to, let's just see what happens when we try this.
Yeah.
What do we got to lose?
At first, Norwegian wood, George Harrison just uses the sitar to play a melody. He doesn't play the sitar he uses it as a weird sounding guitar. It's not until Within You, Without You that he actually uses the sitar as a sitar. And then, of course, the song The Inner Light. It's one of only 4 songs on which no Beatle plays an instrument. That's a good trivia question. That has traditional Indian musicians on it. But to use the tabla that way, the Beatles tend to be known for their innovative sounds. But almost all of that is George Martin. This is, who knows who introduced Charlie Watts to the percussion music, the percussion instruments of India? I don't know. But they turned it into something that fits the rock sound. There's this whole new thing now called post-rock. The Icelandic group Sigur Rós?
No.
Oh, you should.
Okay.
They're brilliant.
Okay. How do we spell this so we can, the listeners can look?
Sigurros.
Sigurros.
2 words. The album that is often called Untitled or Parentheses is the one you ought to give a listen to. Evidently, my son, who's a hipster and who keeps me in touch with this, says that post-rock is a way of using rock instruments to create sounds that are not at all related to the rock idiom. And I think the Rolling Stones and the Beatles do exactly the opposite. They take instruments and sounds not intended for the rock idiom and incorporate it into the rock idiom. So that, it's a strange sound, but it doesn't seem out of place. There's nothing about the instrumentation in that song that sounds out of place. It sounds a bit exotic, but it sounds it works. And I think eventually that leads us to these groups, that are doing all kinds of weird stuff. For instance, the lead guitar player for Sigur Rós plays his guitar almost exclusively with a bass viol bow, like a violin bow. And, he gets eerie, disturbing, and beautiful, but not really rock and roll sounds. It doesn't sound like rock and roll. It doesn't sound like anything really. I think hence the generic name post rock. It has a relationship to rock, but it's something down the road. There's certainly no cars or stolen kisses or terrible car crashes in this. It's in fact, they make up their own language. They sing in a language that is called Hopelandic. They push the vocals to a point where beyond they can have any meaning, because they aren't even singing words. They're singing, but they're not words, but they all sound exactly like words. I don't know Icelandic. I thought it was Icelandic, but it's not. It's a completely made up language.
Well, I'll see if I can find some songs now they would be on Spotify.
Yes. I would say try the song called Popologio. The translation is pop song. It's the final song from the album called Parenthesis.
Okay, so I'm going to look for that, put that up on the show notes page, because I always put together...
that'll blow your mind.
Yeah, I put together a list of songs that we discuss in these episodes so people can hear them as we go through the episode. So I will definitely look for that one.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've seen all the big groups, many of them in altered states of consciousness. I saw Sigur Rós in Cleveland. It was by far the most amazing concert I've ever seen in my life, in terms of the visuals and the music, the stage presentation. They performed with a string quartet and a brass quartet behind the 3 guys, one playing bass, one playing guitar, and one playing drums.
That's high praise, because you've been to a lot of great shows, the ones you've mentioned already.
Saw Pink Floyd in 73, 5, and 7. Their heyday, and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Yes. I saw lots and lots of, big shows, ones that had, not just music, but, stage presentations and things like that. And nothing came close to this Sigur Rós concert.
That is quite an endorsement.
Yeah.
You got me. You got me interested.
Give it a try. I think you might like it. So we get to Salt of the Earth.
Yeah, and I want to ask you why you write that this would characterize the band's next several albums, solidifying the Rolling Stones sound. Why do you feel that way specifically about this song, Salt of the Earth?
Well, I think that's how they end albums. They end albums with big songs, right? You can't always get what you want. They end albums with big anthems. And I think, for instance, the next album, Let It Bleed, starts off with Gimme Shelter and ends with, is it You Can't Always Get What You Want? Yeah, Yep. It is. Yeah, I mean, it starts off with, a song of, disturbing, menacing intensity, and ends with some massive affirmative. These are life-affirming songs. The albums start really, really dark, and they move through and they end with some big, massive, affirmative statement. And I can't remember exactly how, what's the last song on Sticky Fingers? Is it Can't You Hear Me Knocking? Starts off with Brown Sugar.
Starts with Brown Sugar, ends with Moonlight Mile.
Moonlight Mile, yeah. A big, long, anthemic song. And of course, Brown Sugar is one of the great Stone songs, about interracial sexuality. That starts off with a jarring, you could say disturbing note, considering the time it was released. Now it's very rare to see a TV commercial that doesn't have a same-sex and or interracial couple in it. The idea of interracial sexuality in 1969, 1970 was very adventuresome. That was a shocking statement. And again, the Rolling Stones are there, in a sense, championing the possibility of racial integration. It might be, through the lens of sexual opportunism, but it is still, interracial sexual connections.
And here again, we have the gray areas. I want to ask you about a specific lyric. We talked about Salt of the Earth. That's another biblical reference, Matthew 5:13, King James Version. The apostles are preachers of heavenly things, and thus, as it were, salters with eternity, rightly called the salt of the earth, as by the virtue of their teaching, they, as it were, salt and preserve bodies for eternity. That is the Matthew 5:13, King James Version. But I want to ask you about a lyric in there. This is Keith. They both share vocals here, Mick and Keith. Yes. Keith sings about raising your glass to the good and the evil.
Yep.
Raise your glass to the good and the evil. What do you make of that line?
I think it's what I've been trying to stress throughout the whole thing. You don't separate these things. You don't separate sympathy for the devil from a respect for the salt of the earth, the ordinary common people. You raise it. You have. It's a vision of life that is completely integrated, completely it's all encompassing. You don't just raise a drink to the good, because the good can't be imagined without the evil. Whether it's you sense you can't really sense black without white or colors without other colors. Morally, ethically, good and evil are variable. They're constructs. I mean, what is good in one culture might be regarded as evil in another. And I think the Stones are onto that. And I think that's part of what makes it a global perspective. There's a phrase, give the devil his due, right? I think in a sense, they're saying, look, this whole mixed up thing we call life is something that has to be grasped in its totality. And so let's celebrate. I mean, that's, the celebratory dimension of that last song, I think. And I think I love when Keith Richards sings that. His voice sounds really shaky, doesn't it?
Yeah. I love Keith's voice.
Yeah. He's singing that as though he has no confidence in his voice. You've seen the movie, The Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus, right?
Yeah.
There's a huge dance. John Lennon and everybody who's in the audience there is out on the floor dancing to Salt of the Earth.
Yep.
And I think that captures, keep in mind, these are not dance songs, right? Very few, songs by the Beatles or the Stones after about 66 were danceable. And yet that song ends up getting a huge crowd of burned out, exhausted hippies up dancing, and dancing with what looks to be real gusto and relish. And I think, again, you look at that as the conclusion to an album started off with, please allow me to introduce myself. From the individuality, although the individuality of the devil is counterbalanced by the fact that he's been everywhere. He's, ubiquitous in time, in history, in geography. And then you get down to all these people. There's no superstar in Salt of the Earth. Sympathy for the Devil is a song devoted to one, sort of like superstar. And the rest, these are ordinary people. It's street fighting man. It's not, some war hero. These are unknown people, right? The gangster is unknown. The factory girls are unknown. They're basically stray cats grown up and, having jobs, working in the factories,
The faceless crowd.
The faceless crowd.
Looking into the faceless crowd. Yeah, that's the other lyric I wanted to ask you about. I could ask you about every single lyric on this song, but I'll ask you one more before we wrap it up. When I look in the faceless crowd, a swirling mass of grays and black and white, they don't look real to me. Oh, don't they look so strange? What is Mick saying there?
Why don't you tell me? I like that because I think it's this vision of just, it doesn't have to be like rush hour in Manhattan or, Tokyo subway station. It's just, this swirling mass. It's people en masse. It's the potential of street fighting man, to be like a big gang, struggling. But this is just sort of like the ordinary people. It's like this crowd can contain every single character that is sung about in Beggar's Banquet. I'm a little bit taken aback by don't they look so strange? In other words, it doesn't sound affirmative. The lyrics aren't affirmative, but the sound of the song is affirmative, positive. That lyric is puzzling because, don't they look so great, or don't they look so, I don't know, some other positive word, but don't they look so strange is not an endorsement. It's not like it's more like the door saying people are strange when you're a stranger, the idea of alienation. But it's puzzled me. But again, it's one of those things which I kind of like, that you can't quite put your finger on it, but it sounds cool. That's all I've ever wanted out of it. I want something that I can't quite put my finger on, but it sounds cool. That just is just slightly beyond comprehension, but that's what makes it interesting for me.
Where do you rank Beggar's Banquet among the Stones' catalog of albums? Is it their best ever?
Yes.
No hesitation there.
No hesitation. It's the only album on which there isn't a single weak song. It's the only album. I mean, again, this is me speaking personally. I mean, I love every song. Whereas on Let It Bleed, another contender, or Sticky Fingers, there are some songs that are basically throwaways. Although there are some great songs too. I think Sway, the second song on that comes after Brown Sugar, right?
It does come after Brown Sugar.
Yeah, but I think Beggar's Banquet is the absolute peak of the Stones experience. It gets them at the transition. Brian Jones is still part of the group, but he's leaving. And I don't know whether that gives them a certain intensity, but I just think it's an album without weakness, without flaw.
Beggar's Banquet and the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Revolution, They Call My Name, Disturbance. It's been out on hardcover and Kindle versions. On August 2nd, it comes out on paperback through Routledge Books, correct?
I hope so. Routledge is a great publisher. They tend to be heavily academic, and therefore a lot of their sales are to libraries, and so the hardcover is really almost out of reach financially. But the paperback will be reasonable, and I don't think there's a weak essay in the book.
I agree. It is a fascinating read.
Everybody adds whatever your interest in music might be. philosophy, lyricism, musicality. I mean, this is a combination of professional musicologists who also tend to be musicians, and philosophers, literary scholars. Kim Mack, my friend Steve Christman is a psychologist. His essay on Keith Richards' guitar style. I mean, if you have any interest in the Rolling Stones or this album, musicological analysis of ideas, of lyrics, etc., I think the book, at least half of the book will blow you away, probably the other half as well.
Stones fans won't be disappointed. Music fans won't be either. This is a book to get. Routledge.com is probably the best place to go. It's ROUTLEDGE.com.
It's part of a series. And anybody interested in books about music, this is part of the popular and folk music series. They have great books, including my book on the Beatles and my book on Pink Floyd, as part of their back catalog.
I definitely want to get the Pink Floyd one.
Yeah, that one.
Huge Pink Floyd fan.
Well, I sent a copy to each of the members, and Nick Mason and I sometimes email now, and Roger Waters sent me a thank you note and an autographed picture. I felt like a little boy again.
Oh my God, that is cool. Outstanding.
So, I'm still waiting to hear from Mick and Keith, but I'm not going to hold my breath anymore.
Hey, you never know.
That's true. That's exactly right. Eric, you did a great job. I really appreciate the questions. You know this stuff. You clearly know and have deep passion for the music, and I'm glad you enjoyed reading these essays.
Thanks to Russell Reising for taking us through his book, Beggar's Banquet and the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Revolution. They call my name Disturbance. Be sure to subscribe to Booked on Rock at Spreaker or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find us online at bookedonrock.com, on Facebook at facebook.com/bookedonrock podcast, on Twitter at bookedonrock. The email address, thebookedonrockpodcast@gmail.com. You can also contact me through the website. If you're an author of a book on rock and you want to be on the podcast, just send me an email. I'm Eric Senich. Join me again next time for another brand new episode of Booked on Rock.